Oliver, thanks for joining.
Happy to be here.
Great to have you on. So I first saw your work. Jerry Saltz posted one of your pieces recently, and normally, and we haven't met before, which is it's nice that they're meeting via the podcast and via social media that it can actually
Yeah.
do some good for once. But I saw one of your pieces, which initially I thought was a painting, and it was a portrait, and I'm looking at it on your studio wall now of a cowboy that's sort of like an old-timey feel, but it very much feels like a painting, but they're photographic, right?
Yeah, that sort of space between painting and photography has been kind of a constant in my work for the last 40 some years. And although portraiture hasn't been, um, but yeah, these are I think uh, because they are portraits and because they are kind of based in a tradition of portraiture and even a specific artist, this guy Gerald Brockhurst, the portrait painter. I think they look even more like paintings than previous work of mine.
So perhaps people, if they're not familiar with your work, we could direct people to your website, and it seems like a pretty good starting point, right?
Yeah, I mean it's got the aforementioned 40 plus years of work on it, for the most part.
What's the URL for that?
Just oliverwasow.com. Uh, just my name. Yeah.
That'll be helpful for people if they want to follow along a little bit, because it'd be nice if I could just we could just look at some of your work specifically and talk about some of the pieces that are on the site.
Sure, maybe I'll even bring my website up while we're doing it.
So the first one, there's a tab that has portrait paintings.
Yeah, I call them portrait paintings, though they are in fact not physically paintings, though they may be at some point. They're prints. And the work I've been doing over the last 2 or 3 years, have has been generated in part, by using a lot of different sort of digital technology, but the introduction of AI is evident in this work. Um, so hence I guess the kind of painterly look.
Is it a very specific direction that you're giving AI to make it that aesthetic of having this painterly quality?
Well, there's a lot of misconceptions about AI, and it's not really one can enter some text and press a button and get a picture, but it's often a kind of hybrid process that involves feeding it images and creating its own, language models for image sets for it to learn on, and then taking it into Photoshop and manipulating it in ways that I have done for many years. And of course, AI is now integrated into Photoshop as well. So but as I said before, in this particular series, one of the kind of starting off points was this British painter, Gerald Brockhurst, who kind of painted the uh, upper classes in mid 20th century England, who had a very odd sort of kind of uncanny valley look to his paintings, I think, even then. And I've always been fascinated by his work. So a lot of these images, I collect vernacular photographs with and on my website, if you go down to the bottom, found photo collection, one would see it, and one can also see I have an Instagram account that's actually much larger than the one that Jerry posted these images on, of my found photo collection. And most of the pictures that I collect they're all portraits, but most of them are either arcade photos or photo booth photos, and most of those have painted backdrops behind them. So I've long been interested, and for many years I never even photographed a person, really, for the first 30 years or so that I was working. And it's only recently that I started collecting pictures that I became interested in portraiture. So these are kind of, I'm going off in all kinds of directions here, but these are sort of hybridizations of this traditional painting of this guy, Gerald Brockhurst, who of course is looking back to Renaissance painting with the landscape behind you. And then these found photos I collect, which use studios with painted backdrops behind them.
I
Um,
see.
and that when my kids were young, they would come back from school with school portraits where they're no longer posed in front of painted backdrops, but they're now posed in front of a green screen, and then the backdrop is dropped in digitally. So that interested me also.
So these basically these new portrait paintings, this series of
Yeah.
yours is basically a compilation or a composite of these. You said vernacular photography?
Yeah.
What does that mean?
So vernacular just means of the everyday. So, these are pictures of everyday Americans and actually everyday, a lot of them are Russian too and Soviet. But
So like the
just,
found photographs.
they're found photographs, but they're studio photographs mostly, set up portraiture with
I
painted
got it.
backdrops.
And so you've basically used these as the source material for this new series.
Yeah, either directly or just conceptually and aesthetically. And I did a series about 10, 15 years ago. The first portraits I took of people, which on my website are just called studio portraits. And those are, photographs of, friends and family posed in front of a green screen with backgrounds dropped in. And this is before AI. So it's all part of a kind of continuum. And there's another series I'm doing right now called New Histories, which is also on the website, which use AI but are not don't look as painterly.
Got you. So you've been sort of teaching AI, it's learning how to create this aesthetic with you.
Yeah, I mean it's not just, I mean it's AI, it's Photoshop, it's a lot of plugins that use AI basically, but we kind of live in a time where special effects and effects are content in a way. Like, if you're shooting a movie and you want it to look like a certain period of time, you use film stock from that time and it evokes that kind of, if it's the 70s and the film stock didn't hold, it's green, so it tends to look kind of magenta. And there's a lot of like plugins and filters and things that allow you to kind of simulate these effects that in my mind anyway are content, if that makes sense.
That's fascinating. The idea of the visual component, the special effects being the content of the thing.
And that's really going all the way back to the early 80s when I started working, been a sort of primary interest of mine is in that the ways in which photography, film, and painting and the effects of all of those kind of drive a sort of can be kind of confusing in mysterious in a way that I think is interesting. I mean, the fact that you didn't know if these were paintings or not interests me. And it used to be, when I first started working with photography in the 80s, long before Photoshop, people would look at these images of mine that were very grainy and painterly and sort of hard to figure out what they were. And they would ask, what is that? Where is that? Because they would assume, the photograph spoke with a certain veracity and truthfulness. But then when Photoshop came along, I think that in many ways, sort of left the conversation and people assume um, a manipulation, but we still have one foot in the kind of analog veracity, decisive moment relationship with photography, and one foot in this new space, which is one that I've always been, which I'm interested in.
That's fascinating. It sounds like the special effects, not necessarily special effects, but the technique and the way it's constructed in your work, it becomes the narrative in a sense.
In a way, I mean, it's certainly I think there's a level of mystery and uncomfortability that it often comes with. And we'll probably talk about this, but the AI is obviously not a neutral thing, and it comes with an incredible amount of baggage that I find problematic in terms of, I mean, when Jerry posted this thing, it was remarkable. And I told him, I said, you're going to post these pictures, you're opening up a can of, a Pandora's box. People don't know what AI is, and they can't separate the kind of techno-fascist bros who are selling this stuff to us and the really nefarious uses of AI in our culture from, the creative use of it. For them, it's sort of the same thing. And I went through this with Photoshop also. Like, there was a lot of pushback on Photoshop. New technologies are not well received generally, despite the art world being a theoretically progressive place.
It's a good point. I had a conversation with Tony Oursler recently, and
Yeah,
we talked about that. He uses it in his work, but he said most artists he talks to are opposed to it, they're against it. But what you say is true. It's not necessarily just a tool. It could be considered an agent for maybe some nefarious players, perhaps. But if utilized in creative hands, you can do some really interesting things. I think it's not going away.
no. If you look at, like, you know, Baudelaire in the mid 19th century, when photography was invented, he thought it was going to be the death of art. He railed against it and thought it was going to, that it was only lazy people used it. It was horrible, and yada, yada. And it took many years for photography to develop its own aesthetic criteria. That was, early photography was very much based in painting, pictorialism, stage photography, until sort of we started to recognize the decisive moment and all of these aesthetic criteria that are inherent to photography, and then it became accepted as an art form. And when Photoshop came along, photographers, railed against that and thought it was going to be the death of photography. And, photography did change painting a lot, and Photoshop did change, photography a lot. And, when Dylan went electric, people got very upset. There's no soul, it's a machine. And I find that most of the criticism by people are people who assume that you just type something into a box and you get an image. And you can do that. And frankly, so what if that is all that you're doing? I mean, photographers are, quote, only pressing a button. I think that, but AI is a particularly sort of problematic sell to people because it is, part of a general kind of utopian dystopian binary that shouldn't exist but does. And the utopianists are these kind of, pretty nefarious characters who are jumping into this, not understanding really just how powerful this thing is, and not fully understanding that the job displacement issue, the environmental issue, all of these things really need to be addressed. But my feeling is, I mean, let's take the environmental issue, for instance. We have plenty of clean energy. We have more than enough clean energy. The problem is we don't have a government investing in it, right? We don't have the will to do it. But the problem isn't AI. The problem is we aren't, the problem is we're just building data centers with no sort of infrastructure to support them. Um, you know, And then the other issue that AI really pushes at is we are heavily invested in notions of, mythic notions of originality, authorship, copyright. And so artists fixate on this idea that their work is being stolen by these corporations. And it's a really much more complicated story than that. And I know there's people are listening to me say this right now and they're rolling their eyes, but it's like, you know, it doesn't use pieces of the image, it does what artists do. It learns from looking at images. And if it has biases, it's because our images have biases. And you can adjust for those biases and stuff, but it's not uh it's like with music. Copyright is a really valuable thing when you're selling pieces of plastic, right? But once you get your music turned into a bunch of zeros and ones and everybody's downloading music, it becomes a difficult thing. And if you have people making really great music by sampling fragments of other people's music, as many people did like in the early 90s, and particularly before the lawyers stepped in, when you don't recognize that technologies are changing the way people are making music, and you apply these old rules to it, you stifle creativity and you criminalize young people too, right? So it's really about figuring out how artists can get paid and share their imagery and, have a different system where we use, where we pay it forward and where we have a commons where we, do away with the idea that we start with this blank canvas and from our brains spring this thing that no one has ever done before, born from looking at nothing. I mentioned Dylan before. One of the ironies about Bob Dylan, of course, who is the ultimate quote thief. All of his music is built on, folk music that's handed down and mutated and changed as it goes. And he's, notoriously took everybody's music and made it his own. And interestingly, he has an AI project right now, Bob Dylan, where he uses AI to write letters from historical figures from one to the other. So like Chuck Berry will write a letter to uh, Oscar Wilde or something. These wild kind of uh, check it out. It's a Bob Dylan Patreon that he has.
That's great. People also are under the impression that it's maybe cheating or something like that, or using, I mean, the thing is that AI, you have to guide it. It can't really be creative on its own. And you can utilize it in the right hands, it'll make something truly remarkable. But for most people that try to make art in that way, it's just going to look like garbage.
AI doesn't make anything. It sits there. A human has to use it. And the default with AI is basically all the images that have ever been made mixed with the aesthetic of the people who use it. And that's going to be garbage because most art isn't very good, right? But it's kind of like saying most people like Thomas Kinkade, so painting is bad, you know? It doesn't make it's like, of course, most AI is bad. Most AI art is bad because but the idea that if you give a good artist any tool, they're probably going to make something good with it. Um, and this idea of cheating, like what a crazy idea that you can cheat in art. Like it makes no sense to me. What does cheating mean?
It's really, really difficult to make good art. It's extremely difficult for a human or a machine or anything, It's just
Yeah. And again, machines don't make it. It's like humans
yeah,
using the machine. But
that's right.
there's this idea that like for again, like that labor mean something is good. It can mean something is good, and craft can be incredible, like an amazing painting that takes, years to make and you study for years to do it. It's incredible. But I thought it's like when Duchamp put the urinal on the pedestal, I thought we kind of moved, we sort of accepted that the value of art is defined by more than, the craft and that the context, and there's a lot of other variables involved. And frankly, it's also like when people think that AI is made by just mashing up everybody else's art. And all art is made by mashing up everybody else's art. I mean, that's what art is. Nothing comes out of nowhere, it's um I, I think and I hope that this conversation around AI uh will change. But all I know is that I teach right now, and I have a lot of friends, and all I know is that anytime you have a situation where people are ashamed of what they do to make art and hide it from people, but still do it, that means you have a problem. Because I know a lot of people who use AI and don't tell people they do because they don't want the stigma.
That's so funny.
And I think that's a problem. And I think that so many of the comments, Jerry posted these images of mine, so many of the comments were, wow, I really like this until I found out how it was made. And that seemed like a really odd thing to me, you know, because it seems like the backstory is the art rather than the art itself. And of course, that's been a constant issue in art, whether you're talking about death of the author, like we all wrestle with morally corrupt people liking their artwork and stuff. But, in the end, we don't look at a Caravaggio and say, boy, I hate that painting because he was a murderer, even though he was. So time does, change things. But the idea that you don't like a work of art because it wasn't made using the criteria that you've adopted from previous, technologies, or, the criteria that's applied to painting or something, seems odd to me.
I think that should be an indication that you're onto something.
Uh, Maybe. I mean, that's the other side of it, is I think that there is a healthy skepticism about people who, because we're so obsessed with the new, there are people who gravitate towards new technologies simply because they're new. And, there's the guy who did the piece at MoMA, the big sort of, he applied, did a language learning model of all of the artwork in MoMA's collection.
I loved it.
And Jerry called it like,
Rific Anadol, I believe.
yeah, and Jerry
Yeah.
called it like a lava lamp. I have mixed feelings about it. I don't feel strongly about it either way, but I think that there is a kind of fascination often with technology when it's first developed that causes people to go really just into the kind of sort of special effects, the visual special effects of it, uh, which, yeah, which I understand, but I think that there is like a healthy skepticism to, you know, the idea that just because something is made with new technologies doesn't mean that it's cutting edge necessarily, could still be bad.
I agree. Yeah, I think we need to incorporate more nuance into our how we look at things. To say, well, I don't like this because it's this, closes yourself off to an experience that could be very beneficial or could be interesting. I mean, even having the conversation or questioning your aesthetics. One of the things that I think about a lot is the role of art on the culture, and it really trains us to see nuance. That's one of the ways in which it keeps the culture from stagnating.
Yeah. And questioning why what your gut tells you. Like if I'm a journalist, I'm going to be very not only fearful for my already sort of tenuous job because iPhones and have obviously changed the nature of journalism, but there is a real value to the veracity of a photograph that AI is destroying. And when you can no longer say with certainty this genocide happened, here's photographs of it, that's a genuinely, worrisome, troublesome situation. So, I think that there are things are lost with these changes. And if you're an illustrator and you have a certain, and you're working in a commercial market, there's a good chance that, AI is going to be a lot cheaper for a company to use, and you're going to lose your job. I still believe that, it takes an artist to make something good, but in the world of commercial art, sometimes good is much less, has much lower standards than the world of fine art. Maybe, I don't know.
Yes.
But I think it is legitimate, you know, to worry about jobs. Like painters who come to me and say, who are worried about I tell them, don't worry, what you do is going to become even more valuable because you are physically making something and people love unique handmade objects. And they have, the proverbial aura, they have market value because they're unique. And, AI is not going to replace you. Many painters will use it in the same way many painters use photography. But, I think there are going to definitely be huge negative ramifications from AI, which in the creative community, which again, I would posit that the problem is we don't have a government, a support system that can help people with this inevitable transition. And that's, I find it very hard to get excited to fight for a system that we have in place right now where only 1% to 2% of artists make a living anyway. Like, what are we trying to save here? Right? Oh,
You make a great point. And I don't know if you caught that Josh Klein article called New York Real Estate and the Ruin of American Art.
yeah,
You read
yeah,
that? Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. And that basically was telling artists, especially New York-based artists, what we already know.
But I've been involved in the art world for over 40 years now, and it's always been 1% to 2% of artists that make a living, and the rest scrape by with teaching. And, yes, it's rents are, much higher now. Living in a sort of a center like New York and Los Angeles is much more difficult for artists now. But you've also got the gatekeepers in many ways are not as uh they're looser now. I have students who make a living selling work on Instagram
Wow.
and they make
Yeah.
good work, and they don't. Yeah, I even have some students who choose not to show in galleries,
They
because they
prefer to sell on social
prefer
media.
it. Yeah. And the stigma of self-publishing, of, opening your gallery and showing whatever, the economy changes in a way that, again, I think it's kind of like when the music industry, when everyone was downloading music. I don't know if you're old enough to remember
Mhm.
Napster, but
Yeah.
um, when everybody was downloading music and the music industry freaked out and they started suing everybody and taking people to court and stuff. All they were doing was figuring out how to slow it down because they couldn't sell $18 pieces of plastic, CDs anymore. So they were trying to figure out how to slow it down until they could keep only 1% to 2% of people making the money. And eventually they did that through iTunes and Spotify, etc. And the way artists started making money wasn't selling pieces of plastic anymore, but it was through live performance. But you still, if you're not Taylor Swift or a few other artists, you're not going to make money on Spotify. And touring is really hard and stuff. So it's like, again, if we can find a model where people can make enough money to live on it, but not necessarily strive to be the next, Damien Hirst or whatever, but just to make a living. That seems to me the model we should strive for. And I do think that, new technologies are likely to if harnessed properly, can help with that.
So are you based upstate now?
Yeah, I live in Rhinebeck, New York.
Where are you teaching?
I teach in a few places. I teach at Clark University, which in a low residency MFA program in Worcester, Mass. And then I teach at the University at Albany also.
Were you in the city before you went upstate?
Yeah, I moved to New York in 1979 and I lived there until the mid 90s. And then I moved upstate and then I moved back to the city right after 9/11 and then left the city again around 2006 and came back upstate.
So let's hear about the 80s.
Um, it's a funny thing when one's own life becomes other people's nostalgia, which
Yeah.
happens. I was listening to Mick Jagger being interviewed on a podcast, and he was just talking about how like everybody wants to hear about the 60s and 70s and stuff, and it's just like the mythology around things is so different than the reality of it. And how we remember things, of course, is framed by our personal experience. Um, I don't think there's ever been a golden age of anything. People talk about the 80s and the 70s, stuff like they were a golden age. There was definitely a point before money changed Manhattan. Like when I moved to New York, living in Brooklyn was, what John Travolta in Saturday Night Fever. It was like what the losers lived in Brooklyn, right? Um, Obviously now, my kids just graduated from college and they can't live in Queens. They can't afford to live anywhere, man. So there was there it was I suppose a golden age in the sense that artists could go there and afford to live there, especially in the 70s before my time. But even then it was really expensive, relative to other places. Um, but my sort of entrance to the art world was in 1983. I opened a gallery in the East Village with a couple of friends. And really, everybody I know to this day comes from that period in the 80s of running a gallery. Um,
So for
and
you, it was a tremendously connective experience in terms of meeting people and forming community as an
it
artist.
was incredibly connective. I don't look back on it fondly in that, I saw how the sausage was made and it made me very cynical for a long time. I ran the gallery for 4 years and then quit right as we were getting pretty successful because I had to make a choice whether to keep running the gallery or do my own work. And I don't regret the decision at all. And I've never looked back and regretted it. But so yes, I'm very grateful for the people I met and what I learned and the experiences I had. But it made me more. It took me a long time to shed the cynicism of it because there's a huge space between the sort of romantic ideas I have of being an artist in the art world and the reality of it.
What specifically made you cynical about it?
Like we showed Jim Welling, an artist I'm very, very fond of, and nobody would look at his work. Nobody was interested except for, group of artists that I liked and smart people I respect, but in terms of collectors. So suddenly the very people that wanted nothing to do with this work, are all over it and love it and they're on waiting lists for it because of, you know, word of mouth. So what made me cynical in a nutshell was the uh
Was it the herd behavior?
the speculative collecting of art, um and the degree to which the sort of the myth making of the art world sort of drives it. And I lived at a time when you really was the beginning of what we have now, which is this absolute synergy between fashion, money, and art that isn't inherently bad, but it can be very bad. And again, to return to that idea, like who's making money, the really good art that I was interested in that didn't get hyped often because the artist just wasn't good at networking these are all, there's so much good stuff in the art world. And I think that my cynicism, much of it was not, is my problem, not the art world's problem. The world is not a perfect place. Find your people, find peace with what you do, and money corrupts no matter what you're in. But it's also, I want people to make a living. Like Richard Prince, who, was a artist with a big influence on me when I was younger. And he was every artist. He was, all the people I knew and respected, liked, thought he was like, an amazing artist, a really important artist. He couldn't give his work away, right? Suddenly he becomes very successful, very uh, showing a lot, and he becomes very rich. And suddenly everybody hates his art. And his art hasn't changed, right? He's perceived maybe as punching, down instead of up, but the art really hasn't changed. And so even that, like just the ways in which it gets back to maybe what we were saying about AI, where I liked it until I knew how it was made. That space between the inability of people to look at art outside of this sort of context is understandable, but discouraging.
How do you think about context in your own work? I've really been enjoying these past couple of days of just looking through your website, and I can see some of the stuff that you've been doing pre-AI and a lot of early Photoshop work. And I'm really interested in where they're coming from. What is the context of the work? Travel pictures, exteriors, interiors, light, some lovely stuff.
Thank you. I think the starting off point for me was with all my work was kind of because I started out in the realm of photography was to make something that, as I said before, kind of had the authority of a photograph's, veracity, but also, transcended the kind of temporal specificity of the photograph, the spatial specificity of a photograph. And then there is a lot about, I'm interested in beauty and that notion of the sublime, and sort of as sort of the technological sublime, the sublime as it exists, not in a kind of romantic way where it's manifest in solely in nature, but the way it's manifest in technology and electricity and such. So spectacle is a kind of constant that runs through the work. There were never any people in my work until, like I said, really until 2013 is when I did the first picture of a person. So I've been making work for 30 years before I ever put a person in my work. And I think I was very interested in, it was my experience that people in work locked it into a time and a place and an emotion. And I'm very distrustful of that. Like I'm interested in making windows in some ways that we occupy. We're the person in the picture. But then I was collecting these found photos, and I also started to think about why I didn't. I was talking to my shrink, and he was like, "Why don't you take pictures of people?" I was just thinking about it, and I had young kids, and I just started thinking about how there is you can still have the stuff I was interested in, which is the kind of confusion and the mystery and the sort of disconnect between time and place, and in an image with a photograph of a person. And that is often about, playing with time, playing with clothes, playing with fashion, playing with, the tropes of portraiture. So that's what, I took a photograph of my brother. If you look under studio portraits, there's a picture of a guy with a beard sitting in front of a glacier.
David?
Yeah. And David was my older brother. He was 4 years older than me. And he had severe schizophrenia, and he suffered it really his whole life, very sort of non-functional. And was I think a lot of my interest in that kind of hallucinatory space where things are a little unsettled and not the uncanny,
Yes.
unbelievable stuff, came from when I was younger, and drugs, and B, watching his experience, his disconnect from reality, and my fear of being disconnected from reality. I'm throwing a lot of stuff out here without really going into it in any depth, but this was the first picture I took of a person. I wanted to try to make something that for me was moving, that wasn't cynical and cold, because I think there was a certain kind of in my interest in the sort of simulated, hyper real, uncanny valley world, which I do think of as a very emotional place, but in my interest in that, I didn't want to let go of the potential for a picture to really move you also. And so I think going to portraiture was an attempt to kind of locate a pathos in this artificial space.
There's so much there in terms of not just how you're making the image and you're utilizing the technologies that we talked about, but the image itself seems to be a postmodern fantasy that I'm caught up in. And there's all this
Oh,
other stuff there too. And there's this, I sense an interest or at least an awareness of conspiracy theories and the paranormal.
maybe, it's funny. My early work, I did a lot of things that look sort of like UFOs, these
Yeah.
floating objects. And people ask me, "Well, do you believe in UFOs?" And I have no, for me, what I'm into, I mean, yes, my interest in UFOs photographs was in part because before Photoshop, there was that feeling of like, "Ooh, is that believable or not believable?" You know, but it really had more to do, I think, with kind of the aesthetics of the special effects, like kind of cheap special effects of UFO photographs, and also mostly just the kind of metaphor of the floating object, the hallucinatory floating object, which a lot of these floating lights and things, as opposed to, like, I really don't have any belief in UFOs. I mean, it's not like something I think about much. It's funny, I'm looking at my website now and I realize you were talking about those travel pictures. I updated my website and I forgot to put the titles on that work. And one of the reasons they're called travel pictures, they're all given the names of places, um, which
On your travels, you
Well, that's the thing is when you see the title with it, it a title, text tends to cause people to believe something. And so very often there are fragments in the image that we're taking in a place, but equally as often it's just the photograph is kind of a state of mind of a place. So they're travel pictures of places I would like to go or that I imagine. But the title is not necessary, but I will probably put them on there because it's interesting how a title can direct a person towards belief.
does. And I'm looking at terminal lucidity, and that seems like a good reference of what we were just talking about in terms of having some unidentified objects and some interesting phenomena or something otherworldly. I'm interested in these interiors as well. Is it pre-Photoshop? I'm 1999 there.
No, these are
Or
pre-AI certainly,
pre-AI, of
but they're
course.
definitely Photoshop. It's funny. These are I'd always sort of done a lot of pictures of architecture in landscape, and I did a project in Las Vegas where I did a project on this Fremont Street vault. It's this huge 3 city block long TV screen in Las Vegas that I don't think it's on my website, but it was something done in After Effects, this animation. Anyway, I spent a lot of time in Las Vegas and really became interested in this sort of interior spaces of some of these places. I grew up in Wisconsin and was very influenced by Frank Lloyd Wright. And then spending time in Las Vegas, I really start to think a lot about what happens when you bring landscape indoors as opposed to put buildings outdoors. So a lot of these interiors that I did
Ah, yes.
are imagined spaces. Yeah, where you bring yeah, kind of like
I
falling
see
rock.
it. Yeah, I see it. And one is called the Vipassana Meditation Center. Have you sat a Vipassana course?
No, that's an example of the I'm looking for which one that is. Uh yeah, no, there is a Vipassana meditation center in Iran. The stones are a photograph I took in Culebra in Puerto Rico. And the windows are in a shopping mall, I think, or something. So that's all constructed. And then I used this kind of hieroglyphic clay walls up on top. And when I was done, it just felt kind of like I imagine a meditation center to look like.
That's good. But all these are from your photographs that you were.
They're from photographs I've taken and found. A lot of these are made, particularly with my early work, they're made by shooting fragments of found images, usually just small pieces of them, and then putting them together. So there's usually many pictures
Right,
involved.
right, right. So it's a composite of a number of images that you've taken or you found. I love the Windows series. I hope people are looking at your website and as we're sort of perusing it now because
Uh-huh.
there's so much impact in these images and really transported.
It's funny, the two series, Terminal Lucidity and Windows were those do use AI. Those were made, I don't know, three years ago or so. Those both definitely sort of engage with, our current environmental crisis. And my son pointed out to me the irony, uh, and he thought rather awful irony of using AI to make work about um, economic collapse. But
Environmental collapse.
yeah, it's funny. I made like some of these Windows pieces. They all sort of are interiors looking out of windows on, in very kind of beautiful spaces, looking into a world on fire, golf courses on fire, and it's a pretty simple metaphor. And they actually were not printed, but were seen on project. They were projected and as a slideshow. But I made them before the Los Angeles fires. And some of them were like kind of like, oh my God, that's exactly, it looks like you're in a Hollywood Hills home looking out at the world on fire. And I think it's, they're basically the word terminal lucidity which is a great article in yesterday's Times, July 14th, about research being done into terminal lucidity, but it's a state of that often people with dementia or who have been sort of catatonic for many, many years, or nonverbal for many years, will suddenly become very lucid and coherent and present despite all the brain degeneration. And they usually then die within a very short period of time. And it's a really common phenomenon that people, neurologists and doctors are trying to figure out what that's about because it happens so often. And so for me, this sort of the metaphor is this kind of, it's like an awareness when it's too late almost of what's happening. And, I guess the more apt metaphor is the frog in boiling water kind of thing. It's like, we basically go about our lives living these kind of, there's a lot of wealth out there right now, and people are, whistling in the dark as the world burns and stuff. So I think that's having kids now, that's something I think about a lot. I don't have a solution, um, other than doing the right thing when you can and advocating for change. But it seems like that space between, again, that the technological sublime, where something is both beautiful and terrifying and horrific at the same time, is something that we are living with on a daily basis. I mean, I'm talking to you right now. Are you in New York City
I
right
am.
now?
Yes.
Is the sky yellow there today?
Yes.
I mean, I go outside, I'm upstate, but I go outside and it's insane. It's a science
Yeah.
fiction. I mean,
Yeah.
it's like literally surreal. Like it's the wildfires are burning in Canada and the sky is bright green and it's crazy. And I'm not going outside because I can't breathe. It's just like
We're living in a weird dystopian movie.
we're living
But
and I think about my childhood. I grew up with images of a nuclear atomic tests, and I remember that disconnect between, oh my God, that's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen, and oh my God, that's the most horrible thing I've ever seen. And I think that's sort of a contemporary condition. Or 9/11, everybody who was in New York when 9/11 happened, we all were saying the same thing. It was like, it looks like a movie because we couldn't process it as anything but a kind of special effect. Uh, and yet we knew, we were living it. We knew it was very real at the same
yeah,
time.
I think making art is extremely important. I think it's easy for one to despair and say, oh, all this, what's the point? I'm just making this stuff. All this.
Right.
It's really important because it allows the culture to progress.
Absolutely. I think that anytime I hear anybody say, or anytime I think, oh my God, why am I doing this? I should be out working in a soup kitchen. You can also work in a soup kitchen, you can also do good work in the world and be an artist. But B, just think about a world without art, you know? And I think about the art and the songs and the things that have truly made me want to, that have moved me and made me want to change things. So it's collectively, I think art is really important, and no, you're not gonna save the world sitting in your studio, making art, but collectively, I think it's really wrong-headed you know, to think of it as a fiddling while Rome burns, because I don't think it is.
Exactly. 100%. I completely agree. I sometimes go to a monastery up in New Hampshire that's
Mhm.
in the Thai Theravada Thai forest tradition.
Mhm.
and it's called Temple Forest Monastery. If people are up there, they should definitely visit. They're really very serious. They've done a lot of work on a consciousness level. And one monk was saying that he was an activist before he was a monk, and he
Yeah,
would go out and try to make change, but in a way that was motivated by this kind of force in
sure.
which he was sort of militant and violent almost, and said that he wouldn't want to spread that mindset to anybody. And now, as a monk, he's much calmer and he's putting this calm energy into the world. It makes sense in terms of being an artist too. It's the same.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's interesting. My wife, who is a Dana Hoey, who is a well-known artist with a she showed at Petzl Gallery and was uh in her mid-50s decided to go to Harvard Divinity School.
Oh,
And she just finished the program there. And so she's thinks a lot about the sort of the relationship between for lack of a better word, the spiritual realm and creativity, though she was often encouraged, like, how are you going to reconcile this to your artworks? It's like, no, they're separate. She wanted to sort of have them be separate for now. But she was telling me about these monks that just walked for was it for peace? For I don't know. There was a bunch of monks just did a very, very long walk that she was very invested in following, but they were using AI a lot
the
to
monks?
create these monks were, yeah, to create sort of scenarios for people and images and stuff for people, which I thought was very interesting.
What will she do after getting out of the divinity school?
Well, her idea is to work in hospital chaplainry. It's not denominational, but I think that there tends to be uh she certainly aligned herself with Buddhism, I think more than uh other organized religions, but her interest is in giving spiritual care in hospitals, but in not she wouldn't be specifically addressing somebody who wanted a priest or a rabbi or whatever. It's more a general kind of thing.
That's good. That's really good.
People think of sort of theological studies as being kind of like synonymous with Bible school, or the kind of political conservatism and dogmatism and fundamentalism. But I just went to the graduation of the Harvard Divinity School and I felt like I was in, like a socialist club room or something. I mean, it was the most diverse and politically active and progressive group of people I have ever, encountered. There obviously are, one could go to Oral Roberts University also, but Harvard and I think the New York Theological Seminary is they're particularly progressive and
Culture is changing. These institutions are changing. I interviewed Melissa Atterbury, who was the director of the first female director, in fact, of Trinity Church's musical program.
yeah.
I saw the Messiah there.
I saw it here at in Rhinebeck. They
Oh,
have a
nice.
Yeah, we have a really kind of progressive Methodist church up here that every year they do the Messiah. It was very beautiful.
The first time I saw it, it just completely changed not only that piece for me, but how I viewed classical music. Now I just really get into it.
Yeah, and talk about, things having a kind of force, I mean, it's like it's hard to not think that music, that art is a powerful force
Yes,
when
that's a
when you're
great
in the
point.
presence of something like that. It's like it literally, moves you,
That's it. You feel it so directly. You feel it in the chest, physically, in your heart. It is real.
And I think that because we all hold art to this kind of, in this sometimes overly romanticized, but in this kind of, spiritually powerful force. I understand when people think, oh, he's using AI to make art, when people think like, oh, it's going to be soulless. It's basically, just, all of the kind of powerful, emotive, spiritual things that they think about with art are in many ways manifest, the opposite is manifest in this technology. And, I just, all I can say is that I've never met anybody who's actually used it and played with it creatively with an open mind who hasn't sort of felt the strength and the validity of it as on a par with any other medium.
Oh, it's amazing. I use it all the time in painting.
You do.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah, it's
Yeah.
remarkable and it's getting a lot better.
Yeah.
Also, you learn how to use it.
It's funny because one of the things I tell my students when we start to play with it, the first thing I tell them is, I'm not here to sell you on AI. I'm here to ask you to have an open mind. Here, if it's not for you, don't use it, whatever. But the thing I tell them, the main thing you have to let go of, aside from whatever prejudices you have, is your relationship to being in control. Because when I use AI, and I imagine it's similar to an action painter saying, "Oh, I like that drip," right? You don't know that drip was going to happen, but it was an accident, right? When I use AI, it's like often I don't know what I'm going to get, and I can steer it in a direction, but then I like something and I'll push it further in that direction, right? But if I say, if you get an image in your mind or anything in your mind and try to do it with AI, you're going to fail miserably.
Yep.
You have a feeling and an idea and a style, interestingly, in your mind, and then work with the machine to get it, which it's a different way of working.
You have to see it as a collaborator, I think.
You do. And it's a collaborator that you're in control with. I mean, you ultimately, you know, say yes or no. And it can be frustrating when you can't get it to do what you want it to do, but it can be really fun when it does things that surprise you that you then steer. Yeah.
I love it when it surprises
Oh,
you in a way that you're just like, I never would have thought of that.
yeah. And in some ways, because the people who develop this stuff, like when they quote improve each version of these things, it's usually because the improvement, and I put it in quotes because it usually means it's, it's more believable, right? And yes, we do want to be able to make a figure without eight fingers, but I also want to be able to manipulate it so I can get these weird hallucinations and quirks, and you can use different versions of it to do that and stuff. So it's yeah, it's really and also you can feel the DNA of stuff in it. Like, like, oh, why is it like it seems to want to like throw in this cultural kind of Edward Hopper feeling we have. It's not Edward Hopper, but it's sort of all of the artists that have played with that empty light that Edward Hopper does and Vermeer are kind of manifest in this, right? And I think that's great because that's how art works. It's in our brains, as a kind of we've internalized Vermeer and Hopper and culturally. Uh,
Interesting. Yeah.
yeah, and then it comes out. So I think it's fascinating.
Oh, yeah, it is. What programs do you use?
Well, for the most part, the main sort of go-to commercial program I use is Midjourney,
Hmm.
only because I kind of it's the one that allows me to input images of my own and found images most effectively. And I'm too lazy to learn like Stable Diffusion, which I think gives you a lot more control. But I also use um, Photoshop quite a bit. I mean, Photoshop is very limited. It's sort of it's really good to use AI to edit, which Midjourney is not, but to actually produce images, it's not very good. Um, and then there's a great program called Boris FX. I don't know if you know that, but
Never heard of it. No.
it's a incredible suite of effects and plugins and stuff that you can use with other programs that uses a lot of AI in it as well. Um, and but off sometimes it's I'll physically manipulate an image, scan it in, and feed it into it. I think what's going to happen going forward, and I think when artists will really start to use it more and use it more openly, is when artists can start creating their own, training AI on their own images and their own sets of images. You can do that in Midjourney. You can create, what they call mood boards, but like you can feed a bunch of images into it and then do things in that style, including your own images. But I think, eventually there will be communities, I imagine, of people who are sharing uh images and data sets and things.
Definitely. I think we see this in a lot of media too. Like in
Yeah.
film, there's going to be more, what do you call it? Like fan fiction that are fan generated work.
Yeah. I mean, I have a lot of students who do 3D printing, and there's huge communities online where people create models for doing 3D printing, and then they share them with everybody. Because
Oh,
if
so
you
you can make
share
it
them,
yourself.
yeah, so basically, let's say you're making something and you need a couch, well, you can download somebody else's, uh, code or file for that couch that you can then integrate into whatever you're printing. So it's a pay it forward thing. Like if you share, I mean, in some ways, when you go to Midjourney and you log in and you see that wall of images there, you can see who made it, how it's made. You can use it. It's a community of shared creativity. And a lot of people I know don't like that, and they pay extra to go private because they don't want people, quote, stealing, their aesthetic and stuff. But for me, the value, if you share your images, then other people share their images, and you use it to create things.
There's a spirit of generosity there.
We teach our kids to share all the time, and then all of a sudden, we throw them in jail for doing it.
I was working as an art handler for this company when I first moved to the city, and I went to this guy's studio, and he had these like very matte, like powder coated paintings, not powder coated, but very, very matte paintings. And I was interested in the surface a little bit. I wasn't necessarily going to do it, but I was like, how do you do this? And he's like, I'm not telling you.
So often you encounter that. So often. And I mean, I understand like that we live in a system, there is an economic necessity when you're selling objects or whatever to, copyright served a function at one point in time when when the, you know, when it wasn't so easy to copy and share, right? And when you were selling, records or books or whatever. But now it's just a bunch of zeros and ones, and how we market that is we benefit by giving it away. It's like Metallica sued Napster, and then 3 years later, 2 years later, they were giving their music away, right? U2 is all upset because people are, downloading their music. 2 years later, everyone's pissed because when they bought their iPod, U2 had given them music that they didn't want on it, right? So the economic model for how you make money is changing, and we live in a time where, like, I used to have students who didn't want to do a website because people would download their work, and I'm like, you wish, like, when you have that problem, you're successful, right? Somebody downloading and your work, how is it going to hurt you? But also, like, would you rather have theoretically 7 billion people see your work, or just keep it to yourself? That doesn't make any sense.
I like to think in my most hopeful and positive moments that what's happening is that we're sort of going towards a kind of a more ideal society in which sharing and creative generosity of spirit is more normal. And these are growing pains. But that's really what art is about. Artists have always been at the forefront of the culture and really shaping the culture.
There's a, I keep bringing up Bob Dylan for some reason, but there's a great interview with Odetta, the folk singer, uh, who was a huge influence on Dylan in the 60s. And Mike Wallace for 60 Minutes is like interviewing Odetta because Obama gave her the Presidential Medal of Freedom or something. Anyway, and Odetta is a sort of wise old woman, and Mike Wallace says something to the effect of, well, a lot of people say, Bob Dylan kind of stole from you. She's like, oh, no, no, we don't call that stealing. And he goes, well, is that appropriation? She goes, no, 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 we don't call it appropriation. We call it passing on the tradition. We call it folk music, and that's how it works,
It's good.
And I understand, like, it's not as simple as, hey, everybody's giving everything away. I mean, people have to make a living, and it's problematic when successful artists, quote, steal from unsuccessful artists and don't give them credit and profit from it. Obviously in music, many Black artists were sort of, ripped off by white artists and stuff. So it's not a simple thing, but I agree with you that there's growing pains, but it's a transition that's kind of inevitable.
Yeah.
And when I get cynical and discouraged, it's when I realize, like I said before, that very often much of the resistance is just people trying to slow it down till they can figure out how to keep it, you know, tightly controlled. And so that a small group of people can make money off of it. I mean, it's certainly easy to get really discouraged because it's like the fascists are, past the gate. They're running the show right
But
now.
they don't even know they don't know what they're doing. It's insane.
Well, that's the
Yeah,
scariest thing.
yeah,
I'm just saying, like,
yeah.
I read an article today about sort of the collapse of the EV industry in America right now, while the rest of the world is, going full throttle into it. And we're just like, we don't have you know, we could be building clean energy right now everywhere and solve this
It's got
problem.
to happen. Yeah. What gives you hope for the future?
But my kids give me hope for the future. I I I don't, my father was quite old. He was born in 1909, and he in Germany, and he fled, like, he was a Jew, fled Germany in the 30s. And I think about him living through the Great Depression and the Holocaust, two world wars. So I'm optimistic because I do think that the moral arc of justice, is bending, and I think it's bent back right now. I also just have a general belief that um, people, nothing, things change, but the general state of things remains the same. But I don't know. I don't have, uh, what gives me hope is all the decent people I know, and what makes me kind of despondent sometimes is the uh, awful people I see out there. But um, I don't know. When I was younger, I definitely thought in more extremes about, the end is near, and and stuff. But now I'm just kind of like, it's just going to go on. And uh, if I have a brother, an older brother, who's an economist, and he often reminds me of the, basically there is, the life expectancy and the general standard of living globally has gone up over time, and
That's true.
gone down and stuff. So there are, it's slow, but
That's right.
I don't even know if that's an accurate measure.
I think
Uh,
it is. I've heard that, but those are the things that don't make headlines, right?
yeah. And
Like,
certainly if you're, I didn't, dying at 40 kind of sounds like an awful idea. I like living longer. And that's the other thing. And I don't, you asked me what gives me hope. I mean, frankly, the potential of something like AI, which is, you know, can't be separated from the internet because the internet made AI possible. But the revolution that it's bringing on, if harnessed properly, gives me great hope. The idea that we could look at a cancer scan, of a tumor and instantly compare it in a nanosecond to every other scan ever made to create a diagnosis is an amazing thing. I mean, all of the just incredible potential. The other day I was playing around with the feature in my AirPod that allowed, that did instant translation of one language into another. And well, the Tower of Babel concept is definitely here,
we could
you
be
know.
heading towards a Star Trek future.
And people are still going to suck and they're going to, be awful, but
I think you can really influence people around you with how you are and your affect, and even I think just being nice to people, anybody who you encounter goes a longer way than you think.
it's funny though, the anonymity thing, raising kids with this new technology definitely does put you in touch it puts me in touch more directly with the downside to a lot of this stuff, and I'm never like, things used to be better and make America great again, yada yada. But it's like, when I gave my kids their first phone, they stopped reading, it's kind of like, and then I have to think, well, yes, that is a bad thing, but maybe they're doing something similar to reading, and it turns out they kind of are, anyway, yeah, it's easy to fall into uh, extreme binaries, and as I get older, it gets easier not to, maybe.
Yeah, that's good. Well, I greatly appreciate your having these conversations.
Thank you. Yeah, I'll remain in touch. I enjoyed talking to you.
We'll stay in touch.
Likewise.
Thanks,
Good.
Oliver. Take care.
Take care. Bye.